Before we dive into this story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Now, enjoy the story. The clock on the wall read 9:47 p.m. Thomas Whitaker leaned back in his chair and looked around the empty room. 32 years on the force. Hundreds of Friday nights just like this one. He knew every creak of this building, every flicker of the overhead lights, every sound the old coffee machine made before it gave up and died sometime around midnight. He wasn't supposed to be here tonight. He had told Dorothy he'd be home by 8. Pot roast, her famous apple pie cooling on the counter. A quiet evening the way they both liked it. The TV low, her reading, him pretending to watch the game while actually falling asleep before halftime. But someone had called in sick, and Thomas, 62 years old and 3 months from full retirement, had said yes, like he always did. Just one more night, he told himself. One more quiet night. The front door opened. Thomas looked up and stopped moving. 2 little girls stood in the doorway. The older one was maybe 9 or 10, with dark circles under her eyes, and a careful, serious expression that no child her age should have. She wore a coat 2 sizes too big, buttoned all the way to the top. In her hands she held a white envelope, folded once, pressed flat, like she had been protecting it the entire walk over. The younger one, tiny, maybe 3 or 4, stood right behind her sister, both arms wrapped around her waist, face half hidden. Neither of them said a word. Thomas stood up slowly, the way you move around something fragile. "Hey there," he said, keeping his voice low and easy. "Come on in, it's cold outside." The older girl stepped forward. Her eyes scanned the room once, quick, careful, before she walked to the front desk and held the envelope out with both hands. Thomas took it gently. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded in thirds, covered in pencil. The handwriting was careful and young, letters slightly uneven. A few words spelled the way a child sounds them out alone in a quiet house. He read it. "Dear policeman, my mommy sleeps all day and doesn't wake up when we shake her. We are trying to be good. We are out of cereal. I think she is sick again." Thomas read it twice. Then he set it down on the desk, very carefully, as if it might break. In 32 years he had answered every kind of call you could imagine. He had seen families going through hard times. He had helped people on their worst nights. He had done his job, followed the rules, and gone home. But he had never, not once, seen a child write a letter like this. Not a cry for help, not a complaint, just a quiet, honest report from a little girl who was doing her best to hold everything together. He looked at the older girl. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Emily," she said, steady voice, chin up. "And your sister?" "Sophie." She glanced back at the tiny girl still clinging to her coat. "She's tired." We walked a long way. Thomas came around the desk slowly and crouched down to their level. "You did the right thing coming here, Emily," he said. "Both of you did." Emily looked at him for a long moment, measuring him, the way kids do when they've learned that adults don't always mean what they say. Then she gave one small nod. Sophie peeked out from behind Emily's coat, looked at Thomas with wide, dark eyes and whispered, "Do you have cereal?" Thomas felt something move in his chest, something old and quiet that he hadn't felt in a very long time. "I'll find you something to eat," he said. "I promise." He stood up, reached for the phone, and realized with a certainty that surprised him that this night was not going to be anything like the ones before it. Whatever had brought these 2 little girls through that door on a cold Friday night, it was only the beginning. Thomas settled Emily and Sophie at the small table in the break room with crackers, a cup of warm milk, and the only thing he could find in the back cabinet, a small bag of animal crackers that someone had left behind weeks ago. Sophie grabbed a lion and studied it seriously before eating it whole. Emily didn't touch her food right away. She sat with her hands folded on the table, watching Thomas the way a person watches someone they're not sure they can trust yet. He didn't rush her. He pulled up a chair across from them and asked quiet questions. Easy ones first. "What grade are you in, Emily? Do you live nearby? Has your mom been feeling sick for a long time?" Emily answered carefully, like she was deciding with each sentence how much to give. Her mother's name was Laura. Her dad had gotten very sick 2 years ago and passed away. After that, her mom had a hard time getting out of bed some mornings. Then some mornings became most mornings. Then most mornings became every day. "She tries," Emily said firmly, as if she needed Thomas to understand that part first. She's not a bad mom, she just gets very, very tired. I know, Thomas said. I can tell she loves you both very much. Sophie looked up from her crackers. Mommy cries sometimes when she thinks we're asleep. The room went quiet. Thomas wrote down the address Emily gave him and made a call to have someone check the house while he stayed with the girls. What the officer found there told a story without a single word needing to be spoken. A home that had once clearly been warm and cared for, now showing the slow signs of someone fighting a battle nobody could see. The lights worked. The doors were locked. The girls' room was tidy. Actually tidy, beds made, toys arranged in a careful line along the wall. Emily had been keeping things in order. A 10-year-old, quietly holding the house together the best she could. When Thomas got off the phone, he sat back down and looked at these two little girls. Really looked at them. And something hit him. He thought about his own daughter, Renata. The last real conversation they'd had was 3 years ago, standing in the driveway of the house she'd grown up in, her voice calm, but her eyes full of something he hadn't known how to answer. Dad, you were never really home, even when you were there. He had told himself she was being unfair. He wasn't so sure anymore. The neighbors on Laura's street had noticed things. Thomas found that out later. Noticed the curtains always drawn. Noticed the girls playing outside alone on a school morning. Noticed the lights off for long stretches of the evening. But nobody had called. Nobody had knocked on the door. Not because they were bad people. Because they didn't know what to do. Because they told themselves someone else would handle it. Because it's easier to look away from a problem that feels too big and too private. Thomas understood that more than he wanted to admit. How many times had he come home late and seen the light off in Renata's room and told himself she was fine? How many school plays had he missed? How many dinners had he sent a sorry text about from the parking lot of this very building? He had always told himself it was the job. But sitting here now, looking at Emily's careful folded hands and Sophie's sleepy eyes, he wondered if the job had just been a very good reason to avoid learning how to stay. He was still sitting with that thought when Emily reached into her coat pocket. She pulled out another envelope, smaller than the first, more wrinkled like it had been folded and unfolded many times. She looked at it for a moment, then she tucked it back into her pocket without a word. Thomas noticed. He didn't say anything, but he would not forget it. Thomas made the calls. That was what you did. You followed the steps, worked the process, trusted the system that had been built exactly for moments like this one. 32 years had taught him that much. Feelings were fine, but procedure was what kept things from falling apart. He called the non-emergency medical line first, then the county's child services after-hours number, then the hospital to report that a woman at the address Emily had given him needed a wellness check and medical attention. Each call was answered by someone tired but professional. Each person on the other end was doing their best with what they had. And what they had wasn't much. The child services coordinator on duty that night, a woman named Ms. Farrell, was kind in the way that people are kind when they've delivered hard news so many times it has become its own kind of routine. "We're very stretched tonight, Sergeant Whitaker," she said. "I'll get someone out as soon as I can. In the meantime, the girls need to stay somewhere safe and documented. The only available placement we have right now is a group facility about 40 miles out." Thomas kept his voice even. "Together? Both girls together?" A pause that lasted just a second too long. "There's a family that's expressed interest in the younger child," Ms. Farrell said carefully. "For the older girl, the nearest available placement is in a different county. It's not ideal, but they'd be separated." "Sergeant, I understand. They walked here together," Thomas said quietly. "In the dark. The little one held on to her sister the whole way." Ms. Farrell was silent for a moment. "I'm doing everything I can," she said, and he believed her. He hung up and stood very still in the hallway. In the break room, he could hear Sophie asking Emily what sound a giraffe makes. He could hear Emily making a sound that wasn't quite right, and Sophie dissolving into giggles anyway. He pressed his hand flat against the wall and breathed. Then he called Dorothy. She picked up on the second ring. He didn't say much, just told her where he was, what had happened, and that he didn't know how long he'd be. Dorothy listened without interrupting. She had always been good at that. Better than him. "I'll come," she said simply. "You don't have to, Thomas." Her voice was gentle, but there was no question in it. "I'll come." She arrived 20 minutes later with a paper bag that had 2 sandwiches, a container of soup, and a small stuffed bear she had grabbed from the basket by the front door, the one they kept for when their grandchildren visited. Sophie saw the bear and her whole face changed. Dorothy set it in her arms without making a big moment of it, just placed it there naturally, like it had always belonged to her. Emily watched Dorothy carefully, that same measuring look she had given Thomas when she first walked in. Dorothy sat down beside her and didn't try too hard, didn't ask too many questions, just said, "That's a very brave thing you did tonight, coming here." Emily looked at the table. "I didn't know what else to do. That's exactly why it was brave," Dorothy said. Thomas stood in the doorway watching his wife, this woman he had been married to for 38 years, sit with a child she had never met, and somehow say exactly the right thing. He thought, not for the first time, that Dorothy had always been the better half of whatever he was. Later, when Sophie had fallen asleep across 2 chairs with the stuffed bear tucked under her chin, Emily reached into her coat pocket again. She touched the second envelope, didn't take it out, just held it through the fabric, the way you hold something you're not ready to let go of. Thomas saw it, and somewhere in the back of his mind, a quiet voice told him that whatever was written inside that envelope was the real center of this story. He just didn't know it yet. Dorothy stayed with the girls while Thomas stepped into the hallway to get an update from the officer who had checked on Laura. The report was brief and careful. Laura Hartley, 34 years old, had been found at home, not in any immediate danger but clearly in need of medical attention. She had been disoriented and exhausted, the kind of tired that doesn't come from one bad night, but from many months of carrying something too heavy alone. The paramedics had been calm and kind. Laura had gone with them without resistance. She hadn't asked about the girls right away, and that small detail, the officer said, seemed to worry the paramedics more than anything else. Thomas thanked him and stood alone in the hallway for a moment. He thought about what Emily had said earlier. She tries. She's not a bad mom. She just gets very, very tired. A 10-year-old defending her mother with more grace than most adults could manage. He walked back to the break room. Sophie was still asleep, the stuffed bear pressed against her cheek. Dorothy was sitting beside Emily now, close but not crowding her, and the two of them were talking quietly. When Thomas came in, Dorothy looked up and gave him a small nod that meant, "She's okay. Give her a moment." Thomas poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter. After a while, Emily spoke without looking up. "My dad used to make breakfast on Sundays," she said. "Pancakes. He'd put blueberries in them and Sophie always picked them out but ate them anyway, because she didn't want to hurt his feelings." A pause. She was 2. She didn't even know what feelings were. Dorothy smiled softly. "She sounds like she has a good heart." "She does," Emily said with the quiet certainty of someone who has thought about this carefully. "She cries when she sees a sad commercial, even the ones about dogs." Thomas almost smiled. Then Emily said, still looking at the table, "Is my mom going to be okay?" The room shifted. Thomas set down his coffee. He came over and sat across from her, not behind a desk, not with a notepad, just a man sitting down with a child who deserved an honest answer. "The doctors are taking care of her right now," he said. "She's safe, and the most important thing you need to know is that you did exactly the right thing coming here tonight." Emily nodded slowly. She had the look of someone filing information away carefully, checking it against what she already feared. Then Dorothy said quietly, "Thomas, I spoke to Renata last week." He looked at her. "She called the house," Dorothy continued, her voice steady but her eyes careful. "She didn't ask for you, she just wanted to know if you were well, if you were eating, if you were sleeping all right." Thomas didn't move. "She asked about you," Dorothy said simply. "She just doesn't know how to say it to you directly yet." The room was very quiet. Emily had stopped looking at the table. She was watching Thomas now with those dark, steady eyes. "Sometimes," she said slowly, like she was thinking it out as she spoke, "people who love each other stop talking because they're both waiting for the other one to go first." Thomas looked at her. A 10-year-old girl, coat too big, dark circles under her eyes, a folded envelope in her pocket that she hadn't shown anyone yet. And she had just said the truest thing he'd heard in 3 years. He didn't respond. He couldn't find the words. But something moved in him, deep and slow, like a door somewhere inside beginning to open after being shut for a very long time. Sophie stirred in her sleep and pulled the stuffed bear closer, and Emily reached into her pocket, touched the envelope once, then folded her hands on the table and looked straight ahead, waiting, the way children wait when they've learned that the world moves on its own schedule. The station grew quieter as the night deepened. The overhead lights hummed their low, steady hum. The coffee machine finally gave up around midnight, just like Thomas knew it would. Sophie slept on, completely still, one small hand curled around the ear of the stuffed bear. Dorothy had stepped out to move the car, and for a few minutes it was just Thomas and Emily sitting together in the break room with the particular silence that belongs to late nights and honest conversations. Emily was drawing something on the back of a napkin. Thomas couldn't see what it was. He didn't ask. After a while, without looking up from her drawing, she said, "Do you have kids?" "I do," Thomas said. "A daughter. Her name is Renata." Emily nodded slowly, like she was placing a piece into a puzzle she'd been working on all evening. "How old is she?" 38. Emily looked up then. "That's old." Thomas almost laughed. "It is. She grew up fast." He paused. "They all do." Emily considered this. "Does she live close to you?" "No," Thomas said. "She lives a few hours away." Emily looked back at her drawing. Her pencil moved in small, careful strokes. "Do you talk to her a lot?" she asked. Thomas wrapped both hands around his coffee cup, even though it had been empty for 20 minutes. "Not as much as I should," he said. Emily nodded again, unsurprised, like she had already guessed that answer. Then she said very quietly, "Sometimes people get scared of being hurt again, so they just stay quiet." Thomas looked at her. She wasn't looking at him. She was still drawing, pencil moving steadily, as if she hadn't just said something that reached back 30 years and touched something he had never quite found the words for. He thought about his own father, a man who had left early, not by choice, but by circumstance, and left a silence in the house that Thomas had spent his whole life trying to fill by being strong, being useful, being the one who showed up when others needed him. He had shown up for everyone except the people sitting at his own kitchen table. He had told himself it was love, expressed differently, that providing was the same as presence, that Renata would understand someday when she was older, when she had her own responsibilities. But someday had come and gone, and what remained was a phone that didn't ring, and a driveway conversation 3 years ago that he still replayed on quiet nights. "You were never really home, Dad, even when you were there." He set the empty cup down. "Emily," he said, "can I ask you something?" She looked up. "That envelope," he said gently. "The second one. You don't have to show me, but I want you to know, whenever you're ready, I'm here, and nothing you've written is going to get your mom in trouble, or you, or Sophie." Emily looked at him for a long time, the kind of look that children give when they are deciding whether an adult is telling the truth or just saying what sounds right. Then she reached into her pocket. She didn't take the envelope out, but she kept her hand there, holding it through the fabric, the way you hold something you've been carrying so long you've forgotten what it feels like to put it down. "I wrote it a long time ago," she said, "before I wrote the other one." "What made you decide to bring the other one tonight?" Thomas asked. Emily was quiet for a moment. "Sophie asked me this morning if Santa Claus knew our new address," she said, "because we haven't gotten any mail in a long time, and she was worried he wouldn't find us." Thomas felt the words settle over him like something heavy and soft at the same time. "I figured," Emily said simply, "that if Sophie was still thinking about Christmas, then things couldn't stay the way they were." She took her hand out of her pocket. Empty. Not yet, but close. Dorothy came back in, and Emily straightened slightly and went back to her drawing. Thomas looked at his wife across the room, this woman who had stayed, who had always stayed, and felt something shift in his chest. He had spent 30 years answering other people's emergencies. It was beginning to dawn on him, slowly and without drama, that he had a few of his own left to face. Morning came in through the break room window in thin gray strips. Sophie woke up first, the way young children do, all at once, completely, as if sleep is a light switch rather than a slow fade. She sat up, looked around the unfamiliar room, clutched the stuffed bear to her chest, and then found Emily's face across the table. Her whole body relaxed. Emily was already awake. Thomas suspected she had barely slept at all. Dorothy had gone home around 2 in the morning to get a few hours of rest, and came back before 7 with a bag from the bakery down the street. blueberry muffins, orange juice in small bottles, and a coloring book she had found at the all-night pharmacy on her way back. Sophie saw the coloring book, and for one bright moment she was just a 4-year-old who liked to color. Thomas watched her choose a crayon with the seriousness of someone making an important decision. Then Ms. Farrell arrived. She was a small woman in her 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her head and a canvas tote bag over one shoulder that looked like it carried the weight of 100 cases just like this one. She was professional, thorough, and genuinely kind. Thomas could see that immediately, but kind didn't change what she had to say. She spread a few forms on the table in the hallway, away from the girls, and walked Thomas and Dorothy through the situation in a low, careful voice. Laura was stable and receiving care. That was the good news. The rest required more patience. For the girls to be formally placed, there needed to be certified temporary guardians or an available facility. The group facility 40 miles out had one opening, for one child. A family in the county had expressed interest in fostering a young child, specifically a younger child. Sophie. Emily would need to go to a placement in the next county over. Different building, different town, different everything. Thomas kept his face still. How long would they be separated? Until a suitable placement opens that can accommodate both, Ms. Farrell said. Could be a few days, could be longer. Dorothy's hand found Thomas's arm. He thought about Sophie relaxing the moment she found Emily's face across the room. He thought about the way Emily always positioned herself between Sophie and whatever door they were near. Quietly, automatically, like breathing. Is there another option? He asked. Ms. Farrell looked at him steadily. If a certified or certifiable guardian were willing to take both girls on a temporary emergency basis, that would keep them together. The certification process can be expedited in emergency circumstances. She paused. But it's not a small commitment, Sergeant Whitaker. These things rarely resolve in a weekend. Dorothy spoke before Thomas could. What do we need to sign? She said. Ms. Farrell looked at her, then at Thomas. Thomas looked at Dorothy. This woman who had driven back before 7 in the morning with blueberry muffins and a coloring book, who had sat on the floor beside a frightened child without being asked, who had waited 38 years without ever once making him feel guilty for the nights he didn't come home. He looked back at Ms. Farrell. Tell us what we need to do, he said. The paperwork took most of the morning. Background checks that moved faster than usual, because Thomas had spent 3 decades in this building, and everyone in the county system knew his name. Phone calls, forms in triplicate, a home visit scheduled for the following day. By noon, it was provisional, but real. The girls were coming home with them. Sophie didn't fully understand what was happening but sensed that it was something good, and celebrated by eating her second muffin. Emily understood completely. She sat very still while the adults talked and signed and nodded, and when Thomas came over and told her quietly that she and Sophie would be staying together, she looked up at him with those steady, dark eyes. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just said, "Thank you." 2 words, absolutely steady. Thomas had received commendations, medals, letters of appreciation from mayors and county officials. Nothing had ever landed quite like that. On the ride to his house that afternoon, he glanced in the rearview mirror. Sophie was asleep against Emily's shoulder, Bear tucked under her arm. Emily was looking out the window at the passing houses, her hand resting lightly in her coat pocket, where the second envelope was. Still waiting. The house felt different with children in it. Thomas noticed it the moment he unlocked the front door and stepped aside to let the girls through. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was something quieter than that. A shift in the air, like a room that had been holding its breath finally deciding to exhale. Sophie walked in and stopped in the middle of the living room, turning in a slow circle, taking in the bookshelves and the lamp in the corner and the old quilt folded over the arm of the sofa. "It smells like cookies," she announced. Dorothy laughed, a real one, surprised out of her. "That's from yesterday. I made snickerdoodles." Sophie looked at her with an expression of profound seriousness. "Do you make pancakes?" "I do," Dorothy said. "With blueberries, if you like." Something moved across Emily's face then, quick and private, there and gone before anyone could remark on it. Thomas saw it. He thought about what she had said the night before, about her father and Sunday mornings and blueberry pancakes and Sophie picking them out but eating them anyway. He didn't say anything. Some things deserve to be held carefully, not pointed at. Dorothy showed the girls to the guest room, the one that had fresh sheets and the window that faced the backyard, and the old oak tree that Thomas had always meant to hang a swing from and never did. Sophie immediately claimed the side of the bed nearest the wall. Emily set her coat on the chair by the door, folded neatly, the pocket with the envelope facing up. Old habit, or something more than that. That evening, Dorothy made grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup, and the four of them sat at the kitchen table together, in a way that felt, somehow, both entirely ordinary and completely remarkable. Sophie told a long, wandering story about a dream she'd had about a purple elephant who was also a librarian. Dorothy listened with complete attention, asking follow-up questions that made Sophie's eyes go wide with delight. Emily ate quietly and watched the three of them with an expression Thomas was beginning to recognize. Not suspicion exactly, but a careful, patient hope, the kind of hope that has been disappointed before and has learned to wait and see. After dinner, Thomas washed dishes and Dorothy dried them, and they moved around each other in the kitchen the way people do after decades together, without discussion, without collision. Emily appeared in the doorway. "Can I help?" she asked. "You can dry," Dorothy said, handing her a towel without making it a moment. They finished the dishes together, the three of them, quietly. Later, Thomas sat in the armchair by the window after the girls had gone to bed. Dorothy came and sat on the arm of the chair beside him, the way she had since they were young. "You hesitated this morning," she said, not accusing, just noting. "I know. You were afraid." "I know that too." Dorothy was quiet for a moment. Outside, the oak tree moved in the wind. "Thomas," she said gently, "you've been afraid of getting it wrong for so long that you've sometimes forgotten to try." He didn't argue. She wasn't wrong. "What if I'm not enough?" he said. It came out smaller than he intended. Dorothy put her hand on his shoulder. "You showed up last night when you didn't have to. You stayed. You made a call this morning that wasn't in any manual." She paused. "That's not nothing." He looked at the hallway, dark and quiet, where two little girls were sleeping under the same roof, and then something else. He stood up slowly and walked to the hallway. At the guest room door, he stopped. It was open a crack. He could see Emily in the thin light from the window, awake, sitting up slightly, checking that the door was ajar, making sure she could hear, making sure she would know if anything changed in the night. She had been doing this for months, maybe longer. Thomas stood there a moment. Then he walked to the linen closet, took out an extra blanket, and brought it to the door. He knocked softly. "Emily." She looked at him. "You can sleep," he said quietly. "I'll be up for a while. I'll listen." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she lay back down. It wasn't trust, not fully. Not yet. But it was the beginning of it. The days that followed moved at a different pace. Not fast, not slow. Just steady. The way good things sometimes build themselves quietly, without announcing what they're becoming. Sophie discovered the backyard on the second morning and decided the oak tree was, in her words, the best tree in the whole entire world. She sat beneath it with her coloring book and the stuffed bear and narrated a long, involved story to both of them about a kingdom where animals could talk but chose not to because they preferred to listen. Thomas sat on the back porch steps and listened to her. He told himself he was just getting some air. Emily spent those first days watching, not with suspicion anymore, but with the careful attention of someone learning a new place by heart, where the glasses were kept, which floorboard creaked near the bathroom, what time Dorothy turned the kitchen light on in the morning. She helped without being asked, set the table before Dorothy mentioned dinner, folded the throw blanket on the sofa when it slipped, refilled the paper towel holder when it ran low. Thomas noticed all of it. He never remarked on it. Some things are said more clearly by being left alone. On the third evening, Emily asked if she could do her homework at the kitchen table. Dorothy said, of course, and sat nearby with her book, close enough to help if needed, far enough not to hover. At one point, Emily got stuck on a math problem and looked up, and Dorothy leaned over without a word and worked through it beside her, pencil to paper. Emily got the next 3 problems on her own. These were small moments. Thomas knew that, but he had lived long enough to understand that small moments were usually the ones that mattered most, the ones you carried with you long after the large ones had faded. Still, the tension never fully left. He saw it in the nighttime. Emily still woke up sometimes in the early hours. He would hear the soft sound of her checking the window in the guest room. Not frightened, just making sure. Just maintaining the quiet vigil she had kept for so long. It had become part of how she slept. And one evening, coming down the hall, Thomas heard Sophie's voice, small and serious in the dark. "Are we going to move again?" A pause. Then Emily, "I don't know yet, but we're together. Okay?" "Okay," Sophie said. And then, after a moment, "Emily, I'm glad you wrote the letter." Thomas stood very still in the hallway. He waited until he heard Sophie settle, then walked quietly back to the living room and sat in his chair and stared at the wall for a long time. He called the hospital the next morning. Laura was stable, resting. The doctor assigned to her care, a steady and measured woman named Dr. Calloway, spoke to Thomas with the careful honesty of someone who respected the people she was talking to. "She's doing better physically," Dr. Calloway said, "but recovery from this kind of exhaustion, the emotional kind, the deep kind, it takes time, and it takes something to recover toward." A pause. "Does she know her daughters are safe?" "She knows," Thomas said. "Does she know they're loved?" Thomas was quiet for a moment. "She will," he said. He hung up and sat with that for a while. Then Dorothy came in from the garden with dirt on her knees and a small cluster of late-season flowers she'd found still holding on near the fence, and she put them in a glass of water on the windowsill without saying a word about it. Thomas looked at the flowers. He thought about Laura in a hospital room. He thought about Emily still guarding the door in the night. He thought about Renata, 3 hours away, who had called to ask if he was eating well, and hadn't known how to say what she really meant. He thought about how many people were quietly carrying things that nobody could see, and he decided that the following day, he would go to the hospital, not as a sergeant, not with a notepad or a protocol, just as a man who wanted to understand. The hospital room was small and very quiet. Laura Hartley was sitting up when Thomas arrived, not quite upright, more like someone who had decided to try. She had dark circles under her eyes and her hair was pulled back simply, and she looked younger than 34 in the way that people sometimes do when they've had everything stripped away, and what remains is just the person underneath. Thomas knocked on the open door. She looked at him without alarm. The nurses had told her someone might come. "Mrs. Hartley," he said. "I'm Thomas Whitaker. I was the officer on duty when your daughters came in Friday night." She nodded slowly. Her hands were folded in her lap, and she looked at them briefly before looking back at him. "Are they okay?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, but the question came immediately before anything else. Before hello. Before what do you want. Before any of the walls people build. Just, are they okay? "They're safe," Thomas said. "They're with me and my wife. They had blueberry pancakes this morning." Something moved through Laura's expression. Relief and grief arriving at exactly the same moment, the way they sometimes do when the news is good, but the reason the news was needed is still sitting right there. "Sophie picked out the blueberries," Thomas added, "but ate them anyway." Laura pressed her lips together, looked at the window. "That's Sophie," she said softly. Thomas pulled the chair close to the bed and sat down. He hadn't brought a notepad. He hadn't worn his uniform. He was just a man in a flannel shirt sitting beside someone who needed to be heard more than questioned. "You don't have to explain anything," he said. "I'm not here for a report." Laura looked at him carefully the way Emily looked at people, measuring, patient. "Then why are you here?" she asked. "Because your daughters are remarkable," Thomas said simply, "and remarkable children come from somewhere." Laura was quiet for a long moment. Then she talked. She talked about meeting her husband, Daniel, when they were both 23, about building something together slowly and carefully the way young couples do when they don't have much but they have each other, about the house they found and the life they made, and the 2 daughters who arrived and changed everything in the best possible way. She talked about when Daniel got sick, about how the world kept moving at its normal speed, while their world slowed to something almost unbearable, about hospital visits and insurance paperwork, and the particular exhaustion of being strong for someone you're terrified of losing. And then she talked about after. "Everyone was so kind," she said. "At first, the neighbors brought food. The church organized a collection. People called." She paused. "And then life went back to normal for everyone else. Which makes sense. It has to. But for me, it just didn't." She looked at her hands. "I kept thinking I should be doing better, that I should be getting up, getting back to work, being their mother properly. And the more I thought about it, the harder it got to do any of it. Her voice stayed even, but just barely. I'm a nurse. I spent years taking care of people. I knew what I was experiencing. I just couldn't. She stopped. I couldn't seem to reach through it. Thomas listened without interrupting. Outside the window, the sky was the pale, flat white of a November morning. The insurance ran out, Laura continued. Then the savings. Then the job. And every time I thought about asking for help, I just felt so ashamed, like I had failed them. She meant Emily and Sophie. Like the one thing I was supposed to do, keep them safe, keep things together. I just couldn't do it. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Emily told me you try. Those were her exact words. She said, she tries, she's not a bad mom, she just gets very, very tired. Laura closed her eyes. When she opened them, they were bright. She said that? First thing, Thomas said, before she told me anything else. Laura turned toward the window. Her shoulders rose and fell slowly. Does she ask about me? She said, almost a whisper. Every day, Thomas said. And it was true. Laura didn't speak for a long moment. Then for the first time since Thomas had walked into the room, she cried. Not dramatically, just quietly, the way people cry when something they've been holding finally finds a way out. Thomas sat with her and didn't rush it. When it passed, she wiped her eyes and straightened slightly. And then she said something that Thomas was not expecting. I want to get better, she said. I know what that means. I know how long it takes. She looked at him steadily. But I want to. I really want to. Thomas looked at her, this tired, honest, determined woman, and believed her completely. He drove home with the windows down despite the cold. And somewhere on the highway, between the hospital and the house where two little girls were waiting, he made a decision that had nothing to do with protocol. He was still thinking about Laura when he pulled into the driveway. The kitchen light was on. Through the window, he could see Dorothy at the stove, and Sophie sitting on the counter beside her. Something Dorothy never allowed with their grandchildren, which told him everything about how quickly Sophie had found her way in. Emily was at the kitchen table with a book open in front of her, though she wasn't reading. She was watching Sophie and Dorothy with that quiet, careful expression, the one that was slowly, incrementally, beginning to look less like vigilance and more like something that might eventually become peace. Thomas sat in the car for an extra moment. He thought about what Laura had said. I want to get better. I know how long it takes, but I want to. He thought about Dr. Calloway's words. She needs something to recover toward. He thought about Emily, still checking windows in the night. Sophie asking if they would move again. Two little girls holding each other together in a house that had grown very quiet around them. And he thought about how none of this had a simple answer. No form to fill out. No protocol to follow. No procedure that covered the distance between where things were and where they needed to be. He went inside. Dorothy looked at him over her shoulder. Something in her expression shifted. She could read him the way she always could, had been able to since the first year of their marriage. How was she? Dorothy asked. Honest, Thomas said. Brave in a quiet way. Dorothy nodded and turned back to the stove. Sophie held out a spoon for Thomas to taste whatever was being made. He tasted it, said it was the best thing he'd ever had, and Sophie beamed with the particular pride of someone who stirred twice and now considered themselves a chef. Emily looked up from her book and almost smiled. Thomas was washing his hands at the sink when Dorothy appeared beside him and placed the phone on the counter. Quietly, deliberately, the way she placed things when she wanted him to see them without making a scene. He looked at it. Renata called, Dorothy said, low enough that only he could hear. About an hour ago, she saw a small piece in the local paper, an officer who took in 2 children on an emergency basis. She paused. She recognized your name. Thomas dried his hands slowly. She didn't stay on long, Dorothy continued, but she asked me to tell you she called. He picked up the phone, went to the back porch where the air was cold, and the oak tree stood dark against the evening sky, and dialed. It rang 4 times. He was preparing himself for voicemail when she answered. Dad. 1 word. Just that. Renata, he said. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything that had accumulated between them over 3 years. Over 30 years, if he was being honest. It had weight and texture, and neither of them rushed to fill it. Finally, she said, I saw the paper. I figured. You took in 2 kids. Temporarily, Thomas said. Emily and Sophie, they needed somewhere to stay. Another pause. How old? Renata asked. 10 and 4. He heard her exhale slowly on the other end. Is the little one okay? She's currently teaching your mother how to make something on the stove that she's calling a soup, but I think might be everything in the refrigerator combined. A short sound from Renata's end. Not quite a laugh, but close. Then the silence came back, softer this time. I've been thinking about calling, Renata said carefully. For a while now. I just didn't know. She stopped, started again. I didn't know what I would say. I don't know what to say either, Thomas said. I'm not sure I ever have. No, she said, quietly, without cruelty, just honesty. The tree moved in the wind. Somewhere inside the house, Sophie laughed at something. Renata, Thomas said, I know I got a lot of things wrong. I'm not going to argue that. But I want you to know that I've been thinking about it, more than you might think. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, I don't know what this means for us yet, but I saw your name in the paper. A breath. And I didn't feel angry. That's new. Thomas pressed his free hand flat against the porch railing. That's enough, he said. For tonight, that's enough. They stayed on the line a while longer, talking about small things, ordinary things, the kind of conversation that doesn't resolve anything but keeps a door from closing all the way. When they finally said goodbye, Thomas stood on the porch alone for a few minutes. The cold didn't bother him. He was still standing there when Emily appeared at the back door, silhouetted in the kitchen light. Dorothy says dinner's ready, she said. Thomas turned around. Be right in, he said. Emily nodded and went back inside, and Thomas stood there one moment longer, looking up at the sky, and realized with a quietness that surprised him that something inside him that had been clenched for a very long time had just slightly begun to let go. Emily noticed the change in Thomas before anyone else did. She didn't say anything right away. That was her way. Observe first, speak when certain. She had learned early that words used carefully lasted longer than words used quickly. But over the next 2 days, she watched him with the particular attention she reserved for things that mattered. The way he moved through the house a little lighter. The way he sat at the breakfast table without checking his phone every few minutes. The way he laughed, genuinely, without effort, when Sophie insisted on teaching him her made-up card game with its 17 rules that changed, depending on who was losing. On the third evening after the phone call, Emily found Thomas sitting alone on the back porch after dinner. She came and sat beside him on the steps without asking. They watched the oak tree for a while. You talked to her, Emily said. Not a question. Thomas looked at her. How did you know? Emily considered this. You're quieter, but not the sad kind of quiet. The other kind. Thomas almost smiled. The other kind. The kind where something got a little bit better, she said simply. My dad used to get that look after he and Mom made up after an argument, like he'd set something heavy down. Thomas was still for a moment. You remember him well, he said. I try to, Emily said. Sophie doesn't remember as much, so I remember for both of us. The weight of that landed without drama, the way Emily delivered most things. Plainly, without asking for a response, just placing the truth where it could be seen. They sat in silence for a while. Then Emily said, Is your daughter okay? I think she's getting there, Thomas said. We both are, slowly. Emily nodded. Slowly is okay. Slowly means you're still going. Thomas looked at her. 10 years old. Dark circles that had faded slightly since she'd been sleeping through more of the night. A coat she no longer wore inside because she had, somewhere in the past week, decided this house was warm enough not to need it. Small things. But Thomas had learned to read small things. Emily, he said quietly. That second letter. She didn't tense. She just looked at the tree. You don't have to, he said. Ever. If you don't want to. But I want you to know that whatever is in it, it won't change anything. Not the way we feel about you. Not what happens next. Emily was quiet for a long moment. Then she stood up, went inside, and came back 30 seconds later. She held the envelope out to him. I wrote it the night before I wrote the other one, she said. I almost didn't write the second one at all, but then I thought about Sophie asking about Santa. She paused. So I wrote the one you already read instead. This one was just for me, I think, but I think you should have it now. Thomas took it gently. Emily went back inside without waiting to see him open it. He sat alone on the porch steps with the envelope in his hands, the oak tree moving slowly in the cold air above him, and he opened it. The handwriting was smaller than the first letter, more careful, like she had taken her time with every word, pressing the pencil lightly, the way you write something you're not sure anyone will ever read. Thomas tilted the page toward the porch light and read, "Dear Nobody, I don't know who to send this to, so I'm sending it to nobody. Mommy has been sleeping a lot. I make Sophie breakfast every morning. We have cereal, but the milk ran out, so we have it dry. Sophie says it's like eating a crunchy cloud. I told her that was a good way to think about it. I know Mommy is sick, not the kind of sick with a fever, the kind of sick that's on the inside. My dad had that too at the end, a little. When you're that kind of sick, sometimes you can't do the things you want to do, even if you really want to. I don't want anyone to come and take us away. I just want Mommy to wake up and be okay. I want her to make breakfast and forget where she put her keys and tell Sophie to stop singing at the table, even though she doesn't really mind. I'm trying to do everything right. I make sure Sophie brushes her teeth. I make sure the doors are locked. I read her 2 stories every night even when I'm tired because that's what Mommy does. I don't tell Sophie that I'm scared. She's 4. She doesn't need to be scared too. I think I've been the grown-up for a while now. I don't mind. But sometimes I get tired. I didn't want to send the letter to the police, but Sophie asked about Santa and I thought maybe it's okay to ask for help. Maybe that's not giving up. Maybe that's just what you do when you're tired and you love someone. I hope whoever reads this understands. We are trying to be good. Emily, age 10. Thomas read it twice. Then he folded it carefully, the same way Emily had, and held it in both hands and looked at the dark yard for a long time. I don't tell Sophie that I'm scared. She's 4. She doesn't need to be scared too. 10 years old. Locking the doors, rationing the cereal, reading 2 stories every night even when she was tired, carrying every bit of it quietly so that her 4-year-old sister could sleep without worry. He thought about what that weight must have felt like. Not dramatically. Emily herself hadn't described it dramatically. Just plainly. I've been the grown-up for a while now. I don't mind. But sometimes I get tired. Thomas stood up and went inside. Dorothy was in the kitchen finishing the last of the dishes. He handed her the letter without a word. She dried her hands and read it standing at the counter. When she finished, she set it down gently and pressed her hand flat on top of it, the way you place your hand on something that deserves to be held carefully. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Thomas walked down the hall to the guest room. The door was open slightly. Emily had stopped closing it all the way several days ago, which he understood now in a new way entirely. He knocked softly and looked in. Emily was in bed, awake looking at the ceiling. Sophie was already asleep beside her, one arm thrown over Emily's middle. Thomas sat on the edge of the bed. I read it, he said quietly. Emily looked at him. You've been very brave, he said, for a very long time, and you don't have to be the grown-up anymore, not here, not tonight. Emily looked at him for a long moment, and then quietly, without drama, without warning, she cried. Not the way children cry when they're frightened. The way they cry when something they've been holding for a very long time finally finds somewhere safe to land. Thomas stayed right where he was. He didn't say it was okay. He didn't tell her to stop. He just stayed, the way he was learning, slowly, that staying was sometimes the only thing that mattered. Outside, the oak tree stood still in the cold night air, and in the morning, everything would still be hard. The road ahead for Laura would be long. The questions would remain. But tonight, a 10-year-old girl was finally, for the first time in a long time, just a child, and Thomas was beginning to understand what it really meant to be present. The call came on a Tuesday morning. Thomas was in the backyard pushing Sophie on a makeshift swing he'd rigged from the oak tree the previous afternoon. A board and 2 lengths of rope that weren't perfect, but worked well enough to produce the kind of delight that doesn't require perfection. Emily was on the porch steps watching, her homework open on her lap but her eyes on Sophie, the way they always were. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Ms. Farrell. He steadied the swing, told Sophie he'd be right back, and walked to the far end of the yard. Sergeant Whitaker, Ms. Farrell said. She had the careful tone of someone delivering information they wish were different. I wanted to update you on Mrs. Hartley's case before you heard it another way. Thomas listened. The picture Ms. Farrell painted was not cruel. It was just complicated in the way that systems are complicated when they're trying to protect people with rules that don't always fit the shape of real lives. For Laura to be discharged and regain custody, she would need to complete a structured outpatient program, approximately 60 days. She would need documented stable housing, and the home would need to pass a basic safety inspection before it could be considered suitable. Thomas had expected most of that. Then Ms. Farrell said the part he hadn't expected. "There's also a timeline concern," she said. "If the temporary placement extends beyond a certain threshold without progress toward reunification, the case moves into a different legal track, one that involves more permanent arrangements." Thomas stopped walking. "How long?" he asked. Ms. Farrell told him. It wasn't an unreasonable amount of time. It wasn't designed to be punitive, but it was real, and it was closer than Thomas had realized. "And the house?" he asked. "The inspection flagged a few items. The heating system needs attention. There's a window in the girls' room that doesn't seal properly. The porch railing along the back is loose." A pause. "None of it is insurmountable, but it needs to be addressed before any reunification visit can be approved." Thomas looked across the yard. Sophie was twisting the swing rope into a spiral and then letting it spin her back, laughing at the sky. Emily had set her homework down and was watching her sister with a small, unguarded smile, the kind Thomas had seen only a handful of times, the kind that made her look exactly her age. "I understand," Thomas said. "Thank you for telling me directly." He hung up and stood in the cold morning air for a moment. Then he went inside and called his friend Gerald. Gerald was 71, retired from the county roads department, and owned more tools than any man reasonably needed. He answered on the first ring. "I need some help with a house," Thomas said. "Nothing major, heating, a window, a railing." "When?" Gerald said. "Saturday? I'll bring Frank." Thomas almost smiled. Frank was 74 and had once rebuilt an entire garage in a weekend on principle. By Saturday morning, 5 men stood in Laura's driveway with thermoses and toolboxes. By afternoon, neighbors had begun appearing, first just watching, then offering things. An extension cord, a ladder, coffee and a plate of sandwiches from the woman 3 houses down, who had watched the curtains stay closed all year and hadn't known what to do about it until now. Thomas worked alongside them, measuring and lifting and doing the kind of work that didn't require words. At one point he went inside to check the heating unit and found himself in the living room. He saw it then, on the bookshelf beside the window, a photograph in a simple frame. Laura and a man Thomas understood immediately was Daniel. Emily between them, younger, grinning wide, and Sophie, barely a year old, held in her father's arms, eyes half closed in the particular contentment of someone completely safe. A picnic somewhere, bright sun, everyone mid-laugh at something just outside the frame. Thomas stood very still. He thought about the word Emily had used in her letter. "I just want Mommy to wake up and be okay. I want her to make breakfast and forget where she put her keys, and tell Sophie to stop singing at the table, even though she doesn't really mind." He picked up the photograph carefully, straightened the frame, set it back exactly where it had been. Then he went back outside to finish the work. Thomas brought the photograph up on his next visit to the hospital. Not the physical one. He left that where it belonged, on the shelf in Laura's living room, in the home that was slowly being made ready for her return. But he described it to her. The picnic, the bright sun, the way Sophie looked in her father's arms. Laura listened with her eyes closed. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "That was Daniel's birthday," she said finally. "Emily had made him a card with a drawing of our whole family. She got the dog wrong. We don't have a dog, but she said she wanted one, so she put it in anyway." A small sound, almost a laugh. "He kept that card in his wallet until—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. "Emily still draws," Thomas said. "She drew a picture of your oak tree last week and left it on the kitchen counter without saying anything about it." Laura opened her eyes. "She does that," she said softly. "Leaves things where you'll find them instead of handing them to you directly. She's been that way since she was little." A pause. "Daniel used to say she had a quiet way of loving people." Thomas thought about the second letter. "Dear Nobody." Left in a pocket, carried for weeks, handed over finally on a back porch in the dark. A quiet way of loving people. "She does," he said. Laura looked at the window. The sky outside was the pale silver of early winter. the kind that holds light without warmth. "Tell me something good," she said. Not mournfully, practically like someone who knows they need fuel and is not too proud to ask for it. Thomas thought for a moment. "Sophie has decided that the oak tree in our backyard is her personal property," he said. "She's named it Gerald, after my friend who helped fix your house because she says it looks dependable." Laura pressed her lips together. Her eyes went bright. "And Emily," Thomas continued, "beat me at that card game of hers 4 nights in a row and has shown zero mercy." Laura laughed then, a real one, quiet but genuine, the kind that arrives unexpectedly and leaves the room feeling different than it did before. Thomas had been waiting for that sound without knowing it. Dr. Calloway came in a few minutes later for her afternoon check. She reviewed her notes, asked Laura a series of questions Thomas didn't fully follow, and then looked up with the measured expression of someone delivering news they have weighed carefully. "You're progressing well," she said. "Better than the initial timeline suggested." A pause. "I'd like to discuss the possibility of an earlier discharge, with conditions." Laura straightened slightly. Thomas stayed very still. The conditions were specific and serious. Continued outpatient therapy twice a week, a support structure at home, regular check-ins, not a graduation, a transition, a careful, supervised step forward. Laura nodded to each one without hesitation. When Dr. Calloway left, the room was quiet again. "Earlier," Laura said as if testing the word. "Earlier," Thomas confirmed. She looked at her hands, then at him. "Are they ready to see me?" she asked. Honestly, Thomas considered it genuinely, the way she deserved. "Sophie asks about you every morning," he said. "First thing before breakfast. She wants to know if you're getting better." He paused. "And Emily. Emily doesn't ask out loud, but she checks my face every time I come back from the hospital. She reads the answer before I say a word." Laura absorbed that. "I'm scared," she said quietly, "that they'll look at me differently." "They won't," Thomas said. Then more honestly, "They might a little at first. But underneath that, Laura, those girls love you in a way that doesn't come with conditions." She nodded slowly, pressed her hands flat on the blanket. That night, Thomas came home to find Emily asleep at the kitchen table over her homework, one arm curled under her head, pencil still in her hand. Dorothy had put a blanket over her shoulders and left the lamp on low. Thomas stood in the doorway and looked at the scene for a long moment. Then, at 2 a.m, Sophie appeared at his bedroom door. Her voice was small and her forehead, when Thomas put his hand to it, was warm. He looked at Dorothy, who was already sitting up. "I'll get the car," she said. Thomas lifted Sophie, bare and all, and carried her to the car. Emily appeared in her coat before he reached the front door, already awake, already ready, already there. Because of course she was. In the hospital waiting room, with Sophie drowsy against his shoulder and Emily sitting close beside him, Thomas looked at his phone. He thought about Dr. Calloway saying earlier. He thought about Laura asking, "Are they ready?" He thought about protocol and procedure, and the careful, necessary boundaries of systems built to protect people. And then he thought about Sophie's warm forehead, and Emily's quiet face, and a letter that began, "Dear Nobody." He scrolled to Laura's number, the one Dr. Calloway had approved sharing for family emergencies. His thumb hovered. Emily looked at him. She didn't say anything. She just looked at him with those steady, dark eyes that had seen too much and understood more. Thomas pressed call. Sophie's fever broke before sunrise. The doctor on duty was calm and reassuring. A mild infection common in children, nothing serious. She would be fine. Rest, fluids, home by morning. Thomas sat in the waiting room chair with Sophie asleep against his shoulder, her breathing slow, and even now, the bear tucked between them. Emily sat beside him, close enough that their arms touched, her eyes open, watching the hallway with the quiet alertness that was so deeply hers. The waiting room was nearly empty at that hour. A few soft voices down the corridor, the low hum of the building breathing around them. Thomas was watching the entrance doors when they opened. Laura walked in. She was accompanied by Dr. Calloway, who had arranged the early discharge that morning, with the careful efficiency of someone who understood that medicine and paperwork mattered less, sometimes, than the right moment. Laura was dressed simply, her coat buttoned, her eyes moving across the room until they found what they were looking for. She stopped when she saw Sophie. Thomas felt Emily go very still beside him. Laura walked slowly across the waiting room. She didn't rush. Maybe she couldn't. Maybe her legs were uncertain. Or maybe she understood instinctively that this moment was too important to move through quickly. She stopped a few feet away. Sophie stirred against Thomas's shoulder, opened her eyes, looked up, and saw her mother. "Mommy," she said, simply, completely. Laura crouched down to her level. Her hands came up and then stopped, just for a second, just a breath, hovering. "Are you sure you still want me?" she whispered. Sophie reached out and put both arms around her mother's neck. "You're my mommy," she said. Laura held her. Thomas looked away to give them that moment. When he looked back, Laura was standing. Sophie held against her, and she was looking at Emily. Emily had stood up from her chair. She was very still, the way she was still when she was deciding something important. Laura took one step toward her, then another. She didn't reach out. She just stopped close and looked at her daughter. Really looked at her, the way you look at someone you've missed with your whole self. "I'm sorry," Laura said quietly. "For the mornings I couldn't get up, for the cereal, for all of it. I'm going to keep working on it every day." Emily looked at her for a long moment, then she stepped forward and put her arms around her mother. Not dramatically, not with words, just held on. Thomas stood and moved quietly to where Dr. Calloway waited near the door, giving the three of them the space that belonged only to them. Dorothy arrived 20 minutes later. She took one look at the corner of the waiting room where Laura sat with both girls tucked against her, and didn't say a single word, just reached over and took Thomas's hand. They stood together and watched. Months passed. Laura came home, to the house that had been repaired and warmed and quietly put back in order by 5 men with thermoses and a neighborhood that finally showed up. She went to therapy twice a week. She worked a few hours at the clinic downtown, building back slowly on her own terms. They were hard days. She didn't pretend otherwise. Emily still kept a few crackers in the drawer beside her bed. Old habit. But she left her door open at night now, all the way open. Sophie named every tree she encountered. None of them were as good as Gerald. Renata visited on a Saturday in early spring. It was a short visit, and careful, and not without its awkward silences. But she sat at the kitchen table and drank Dorothy's coffee, and at one point Sophie climbed into her lap without asking permission, the way Sophie did with everyone she decided she liked. Renata looked at Thomas over Sophie's head. He looked back. No grand speeches. No resolved decades in an afternoon. Just a table, and people trying. That evening, after everyone had gone, Thomas went to the shelf in the study where he kept the things that mattered. He opened the small cedar box beside his service medal and placed Emily's 2 letters inside gently, one on top of the other. He stood there for a moment. Dorothy came to stand beside him. He looked at the box, at the medal, at 32 years of showing up for strangers. "I spent 30 years answering emergencies," he said quietly. "I didn't realize silence was the loudest one." Dorothy leaned her head against his shoulder. Outside, the oak tree stood in the last of the evening light, steady and unhurried, the way things are when they have decided to stay. Fade out. The end. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you haven't already, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from.